The cold winds of Kratos swept across Central Purge Square, carrying with them the bitter scent of industrial waste and the metallic tang of fear. Towering buildings of steel and concrete surrounded the square, their surfaces stained with the remnants of countless dust storms. Overhead, the perpetually gray sky seemed to press down on the gathered crowd, as if the very atmosphere of the mining outpost planet conspired with its rulers to crush any spark of defiance. In the center of the square stood a raised platform, stark and utilitarian in design. Upon it, secured to a metal post by energy restraints that hummed with quiet menace, was Lyra. Her pale blue skin seemed almost luminescent against the drab surroundings, her silver eyes reflecting the harsh lights of the execution stage. She was a Xylosian, her delicate features and lithe frame marking her as distinctly non-human among the sea of faces below. Though her wrists were bound and her body displayed evidence of rough handling, bruises darkening her skin to a deeper blue in places, there was no plea in her expression, no desperate begging for mercy. Only a quiet defiance remained in the set of her jaw and the unwavering gaze she directed at her captors. Surrounding the platform were troops of the Orion Dominion, their black armor absorbing what little light reached the square. Their faceplates revealed nothing of the humans beneath, rendering them as soulless extensions of the regime they served. Hovering drones circled overhead, their cameras recording the proceedings for mandatory viewing across the colony. The crowd that had gathered maintained a cautious distance from the platform, some there by choice to witness what happened to traitors, others forced to attend as a warning. A voice boomed across the square, amplified to an uncomfortable volume. "Citizen Lyra of Xylosi, you stand convicted of spreading heretical ideologies and betraying the interests of the Orion Dominion. Such sedition cannot be tolerated for the continued prosperity and security of our alliance." From his position at the edge of the square, Kale watched with a churning stomach. He hadn't meant to be here at all. The maintenance tunnel he'd been repairing had simply opened out near the square, and the commotion had drawn his attention. Now, he couldn't look away. Dressed in the gray coveralls of a low-level technician, smudged with oil and marked with the Dominion's insignia, he was just another anonymous face in the crowd. One of countless humans who kept the machinery of Kratos functioning while trying to remain invisible to those in power. Kale's hands, calloused from years of manipulating tools and crawling through maintenance shafts, clenched at his sides. For years on this dust-choked rock had taught him to keep his head down, to swallow his disgust at the Dominion's brutality. Survival meant silence. Intervention meant death. He repeated these mantras to himself as he watched the commander raise his hand, signaling for the execution to proceed. The executioner stepped forward, activating a weapon that hummed with deadly energy. The crowd fell silent, not even a whisper disturbing the moment as the blade was raised. Lyra lifted her head, her silver eyes seemingly searching the crowd one last time, not in fear, but as if committing the moment to memory. Time seemed to slow for Kale. In that instant, unbidden memories flooded his mind. The stories his grandmother had told him of Earth before the Dominion, of a time when humans stood for something more than mere survival. The quiet conversations among workers about vanished friends, the hollow-eyed children in the mining districts. And suddenly, he could no longer pretend this wasn't his concern. The weapon began its descent toward Lyra's exposed neck. Without conscious thought, Kale lunged forward. His body moved before his mind had fully formed the plan. He shoved past the thin security barrier, vaulted onto the platform, and in one desperate motion, slammed his body into the executioner. The energy blade sizzled past, missing both him and Lyra by centimeters, cutting instead through the control panel of her restraints. "What are you doing?" Lyra hissed in accented common, her silver eyes wide with shock. The platform erupted into chaos. Guards shouted, crowd members screamed, and the commander bellowed orders that were lost in the din. Kale pulled a multi-tool from his pocket, frantically working at the failing restraints, taking advantage of the system malfunction caused by the damaged control panel. "Honestly," he muttered, his fingers flying over the locks, I have no idea. The restraints fell away, and Kale grabbed Lyra's arm, pulling her toward the edge of the platform. A stun blast from a guard's weapon scorched the metal where they had stood a second earlier. The crowd was scattering now, creating a chaotic sea of bodies that offered temporary cover. "This way," Kale yelled, plunging into the mass of people, maintaining his grip on Lyra's wrist. Behind them, the amplified voice of the commander ordered the square sealed. Dominion troops began forming a perimeter, their weapons raised. Kale yanked Lyra down a narrow alley between two prefabricated buildings, his mind racing to recall the maintenance passages and service corridors that might offer escape. The wail of alarms filled the air as the colony's security systems activated, automated announcements ordering citizens to their quarters for an emergency lockdown. "You're insane," Lyra said as they sprinted through the alley, her voice remarkably steady despite their pace. "They'll kill you too now." "Probably," Kale agreed, peering cautiously around a corner before pulling her down another passageway. "But I couldn't just watch them," he trailed off, unsure how to explain his sudden, irrevocable decision. A patrol drone whirred overhead, its scanners sweeping the area. Kale pressed Lyra against the wall, into the shadow of a ventilation shaft. They held their breath as the mechanical eye passed over their position. For an agonizing moment, Kale was certain they'd been spotted, but the drone continued on its programmed path. "We need to get out of the central districts," Kale whispered once the drone had passed. "They'll have the heaviest security here." Lyra nodded, her silver eyes darting around, assessing their surroundings with a keenness that suggested she was no stranger to dangerous situations. "The marketplace," she suggested. "Many people, many smells. Harder for them to track." Kale eyed her with surprise and a touch of suspicion. "You know Kratos well for someone who was about to be executed." "I've been here 3 months," she replied tersely. "Long enough to learn where to hide." They made their way toward the outer districts, moving from shadow to shadow, freezing at each patrol's passage. The marketplace was a sprawling, chaotic assembly of makeshift stalls and repurposed shipping containers where colonists traded everything from synthesized food to salvaged tech parts. The crowds were thinner than usual due to the security alert, but there were still enough people to provide some cover. As they wove through the stalls, Kale noticed how Lyra moved, graceful but cautious, her senses clearly heightened. She ducked into a recess before he even heard the approaching patrol, pulling him with her. Her skin, cool to the touch, seemed to pulse slightly under his fingers, as if some energy coursed just beneath the surface. A trader at a nearby stall eyeballed them suspiciously. Kale realized they made a conspicuous pair, a disheveled human in maintenance coveralls and a blue-skinned Xylosian whose features were recognizable from the execution broadcast. He quickly grabbed a ragged poncho from a pile of used clothing at a stall, tossing a few credit chips to the disinterested vendor, and handed it to Lyra. "Cover yourself," he murmured. "You're too noticeable." She wrapped the poncho around her shoulders, pulling the hood low over her distinctive features. They continued through the market, the announcement systems overhead repeatedly broadcasting their descriptions and warnings about harboring fugitives. "Why did you do it?" Lyra asked softly as they paused in the shadow of a large stall selling reclaimed water purifiers. "Why risk everything for me?" "You don't know me." Kale glanced at her, realizing he didn't have a rational answer. "I don't know," he admitted. "I just couldn't watch it happen." "Humans don't typically care what happens to non-humans in Dominion space," she observed, her tone not accusatory but curious. "Yo, maybe I'm not a typical human," he replied, his attention focused on scanning for a path out of the marketplace. "There, that maintenance hatch leads to the old water reclamation tunnels. We can use them to get to the industrial district." They slipped past the hatch, Kale using his worker's access code to unlock it. The tunnel beyond was damp and reeked of chemicals, but it was empty of patrols. They moved as quickly as the slippery surface would allow, the sounds of the search growing distant behind them. After what seemed like hours of navigation through the labyrinthine tunnels, guided by Kale's knowledge of the colony's infrastructure, they emerged in an abandoned processing facility in the industrial district. The cavernous space, once used for refining or before more efficient methods were developed, was now a graveyard of machinery and equipment deemed not worth salvaging. "We can rest here," Kale said, his voice echoing slightly in the vast space. Dominion patrols rarely come to these decommissioned facilities. Too many places for their precious troops to have accidents. Lyra sank onto a crate, her composure finally cracking to reveal exhaustion. Blood seeped through the poncho at her shoulder, and Kale noticed for the first time that she'd been wounded, likely during their frantic escape. "You're hurt," he said, approaching cautiously. She waved him away. "It's minor. A grazing shot from one of the guards." Kale ignored her protest, rummaging through an old emergency cabinet until he found a basic medical kit. "Let me see," he insisted, setting the kit down beside her. "I've patched up worse in the maintenance corps." After a moment's hesitation, Lyra pulled aside the poncho and the torn fabric of her simple garment, revealing a burn wound on her shoulder. The injury wasn't deep, but the surrounding skin had taken on a worrying dark blue hue. Kale cleaned the wound as gently as possible, noting that her blood was not so different from his own, perhaps a bit more violet in hue. Lyra remained silent throughout his ministrations, only the occasional tightening around her eyes betraying her pain. "What did they mean when they said you spread heretical ideologies?" Kale asked as he applied a synthetic skin patch to the wound. "What did you do to earn a public execution?" Lyra was quiet for so long that Kale thought she might not answer. When she did speak, her voice was soft but intense. "I remembered," she said, "and I shared those memories with others." "Remembered what?" Her silver eyes met his, searching, evaluating. "Before the Dominion came to Xylosci, we were keepers of history, true history, not the sanitized versions the Dominion feeds its subjects. My people have a way of passing knowledge from generation to generation that's more than just telling stories. We can share memories, experiences directly from mind to mind." Kale's hands stilled on the medical supplies. "That's why the Dominion hates your kind? Because you can share unfiltered information?" "Partly," Lyra nodded, "and partly because we remember what the Dominion wishes forgotten. The worlds they've stripped bare, the peoples they've subjugated or eradicated, the lies they've told to maintain control." She flexed her injured shoulder carefully. "I was part of a network. We called ourselves Memory Keepers. We preserved the truth and shared it with those who sought it." "And they caught you," Kale surmised. "They caught me," she agreed grimly. "But not before I passed what I know to others. The memories live on, even if I had died today." Kale sat back on his heels, processing her words. If what she said was true, she was far more than just another victim of the Dominion's oppression. She was actively working against them, a resistance member with valuable skills and knowledge. "So now what?" he asked, packing away the medical supplies. "The entire colony is looking for us. They'll eventually search these facilities." "Now," Lyra said with a slight smile that didn't reach her eyes, "you tell me why a human maintenance worker would risk everything to save a seditious alien." "I need to know if I can trust you, Kale." He started at the sound of his name, then remembered the ID badge on his coveralls. "Fair enough," he conceded, settling onto a crate opposite her. "I grew up on Centauri Prime. My family weren't important, just merchant-class citizens with enough standing to live comfortably. I believed the Dominion propaganda like everyone else. Stability, security, progress." He ran a hand through his dust-streaked hair. "Then there was an incident, an uprising in the non-human quarters. The Dominion called it a terrorist attack and responded with a pacification operation. My parents and sister were in the commercial district that day, shopping. They were killed in the crossfire." His voice grew flat, emotionless, as he recounted the memory. "Later, I saw leaked footage that showed there was no uprising. The Dominion forces fired first on unarmed protesters. The entire narrative was fabricated." "I'm sorry," Lyra said softly. Kale shrugged, the gesture belying the pain evident in his eyes. "I couldn't stay on Centauri after that. I had technical skills, so I took a contract on Kratos. Figured a remote mining outpost would be someplace to disappear, to forget. But the Dominion is the same everywhere, isn't it? Just with different scenery." And you've been here how long? For years, Kale said, keeping my head down, doing my job. Until today. He gave a humorless laugh. I guess watching them about to execute, you just broke something. Reminded me of what I've been trying to forget. That staying silent makes me complicit. Lyra studied him, her alien features unreadable. You've thrown away your life here, she observed. They won't stop hunting you now. I know, Kale acknowledged. But for the first time in years, I can actually look at myself without disgust. So there's that. He stood up, stretching muscles that had tensed during their flight. We should try to rest. Tomorrow will be harder. They'll expand the search perimeters, bring in more resources. As if in confirmation of his words, a distant announcement echoed through the facility's broken windows, detailing heightened security measures and increased rewards for information leading to their capture. We can't stay on Kratos, Lyra said, her voice taking on a new urgency. They'll find us eventually. I have contacts, people who help the memory keepers. There's a communications relay in the northern mountains. If we can reach it, we might be able to arrange transport off-world. The northern mountains? Kale echoed incredulously. That's beyond the habitation zone. Crossing the Deadlands to get there would be suicide. So is staying here, Lyra countered. At least the Deadlands won't actively hunt us. Kale couldn't argue with her logic. They were trapped in a colony that was rapidly becoming a prison, with every citizen potentially an informant for the right price. The Deadlands, the toxic, radiation-warped waste that stretched between the mining colony and the mountain range, offered dangers of a different sort, but at least the possibility of escape. We'll need supplies, he said, already mentally cataloging what they would require. Water purifiers, radiation shields, navigation equipment. Can you get those things? Kale smiled grimly. I maintain the equipment for survey teams that occasionally venture out there. I know where the gear is stored and how to access it. Then we leave at first light, Lyra decided. The night shift has fewer guards at the perimeter checkpoints. They spent the remaining hours of the night making rudimentary preparations, gathering discarded tools that might be useful, fashioning crude weapons from broken machinery parts, taking turns catching brief periods of restless sleep. During one of his watches, Kale found himself studying Lyra as she slept, her blue skin almost luminescent in the dim emergency lighting that still functioned in the facility. She was alien, yes, but there was something compellingly familiar in her determination, her resilience. The Dominion taught that non-humans were fundamentally different, inherently less. But in Lyra, Kale saw the same core qualities he recognized in the best of his own kind. Courage, conviction, the capacity for hope even in desperate circumstances. When morning came, or what passed for morning on Kratos, a subtle lightening of the perpetually dust-choked sky, they set out. Kale led them through maintenance tunnels and abandoned processing lines, carefully timing their movements to avoid the shift changes of the skeleton crews that still monitored portions of the industrial zone. They reached the equipment storage facility as the colony was fully awakening, alarms still periodically sounding to remind citizens of the ongoing manhunt. Kale used his access codes to enter the building, grateful that his credentials hadn't yet been deactivated. Quick, he urged Lyra as they slipped inside. Grab everything on this list. He passed her a data pad on which he'd outlined the essential equipment. I'll get the environmental suits. We can't survive out there without them. They worked efficiently, gathering portable water, recyclers, nutrient packs, medical supplies, and the compact but vital environmental shields that would protect them from the worst of the Deadlands radiation. Kale located 2 survey team suits, not as robust as proper environmental gear, but adequate for their needs and less conspicuous than full radiation armor. We'll need weapons, Lyra noted as they packed their supplies into equipment bags. Kale hesitated. I'm not a fighter. Neither am I, by choice, she replied. But the Deadlands have predators, and the Dominion has patrols. We need to defend ourselves. Reluctantly, Kale led her to a secure cabinet where sidearms were stored for survey teams. I don't have authorization for these, he admitted, studying the biometric lock. But I can bypass it. Give me a minute. As Kale worked on the lock, Lyra kept watch at the window, her body tense. Patrol approaching, she warned suddenly. 2 guards heading this way. Cale cursed under his breath, his fingers flying over the security panel. Almost there. They're coming to the door, Lyra hissed, ducking away from the window. The lock disengaged with a soft click. Cale grabbed 2 pulse pistols and a handful of energy cells, stuffing them into their packs just as the facility door slid open. Routine check, they said, one guard was saying to the other as they entered. Like fugitives would be stupid enough to. The guard froze, spotting Cale and Lyra. For a heartbeat, nobody moved. Then both guards reached for their weapons. Lyra moved with startling speed, her hand extending toward the guards. A pulse of energy, visible as a ripple in the air, emanated from her fingers, striking the guards before they could draw their weapons. They crumpled to the floor, unconscious. Cale stared at her in shock. What? How did you do that? Xylosians can manipulate energy fields, she explained tersely, already moving to grab one of the fallen guards' weapons. It's another reason the Dominion fears us. This one has a better range than those pistols you took. Is that part of your memory-sharing ability? Related, but different. She tossed him the second guard's weapon. We need to go now. They'll be missed soon. They dragged the unconscious guards into a storage closet, then donned the environmental suits, adjusting them to fit their different physiologies. The suits would conceal their identities and protect them from the harsh conditions outside the colony, but they were bulky and would slow their progress. Exiting the facility through a maintenance door, they made their way cautiously toward the colony's perimeter. The industrial district abutted the boundary fence, a towering barrier of energy fields and physical barricades designed more to keep the Deadlands out than to keep colonists in. However, Cale knew that survey teams regularly passed through checkpoints in the fence for resource exploration. There, he whispered, pointing to a small checkpoint staffed by a single guard. That's used by geological teams. If we can convince them we're an authorized survey team. With stolen gear and stolen IDs? Lyra sounded skeptical. We don't need IDs, Cale explained. The suits have transponders that register as authorized personnel. As long as we act confident, the guard shouldn't question us. They approached the checkpoint, forcing themselves to walk with the purposeful stride of workers on assignment rather than fugitives fleeing for their lives. Cale nodded to the guard as they neared. Survey Team Epsilon 12, he stated, using a designation he knew existed but was not currently active. Authorization for Sector 7 exploration. The guard looked bored, barely glancing at his console to verify the transponder signals. Sector 7? Rather you than me. That place is a wasteland even by Deadland standards. Orders from above. Cale shrugged. They think there might be new or deposits. The guard waved them through, the barrier field flickering briefly to allow their passage. Good luck. Check in at the standard intervals, or we'll have to send a rescue team. Will do, Cale agreed, fighting to keep his voice casual. They passed through the barrier and stepped onto the barren ground beyond the colony. The landscape before them was a nightmarish terrain of twisted rock formations and dust plains, the horizon obscured by the perpetual haze of radiation storms. In the distance, barely visible, the jagged peaks of the northern mountains rose like the teeth of some primordial beast. How far? Lyra asked once they were beyond earshot of the checkpoint. 3 days. Maybe 4 with these suits slowing us down, Cale replied. If the weather holds. As if mocking his words, a low rumble of thunder sounded from the distance, and the sky to the north darkened ominously. And if it doesn't? Lyra eyed the approaching storm. Then we find shelter and hope our radiation shields hold. Cale adjusted his pack. Welcome to the Deadlands. They set out across the blighted terrain, keeping a steady pace despite the awkward bulk of their environmental suits. The twisted landscape of the Deadlands unfolded before them, a monument to the consequences of unchecked resource extraction. What had once been a diverse ecosystem was now a toxic wasteland, the soil poisoned by heavy metals, the air laden with radioactive particles from exposed mineral deposits. Occasionally, they passed the remains of abandoned outposts, early attempts at establishing mining operations that had been deemed too dangerous or unprofitable to maintain. These skeletal structures provided brief respite from the harsh environment, places to rest and check their equipment. As the first day wore on, the storm Kale had noticed continued to build on the horizon. The wind increased, carrying with it a fine dust that reduced visibility and tested the seals of their environmental suits. "We need to find substantial shelter," Kale said as the light began to fade. "These storms can last for days, and they're deadly to anyone caught in the open." They altered their course slightly, heading toward what appeared to be a larger installation in the near distance. The remains of an early processing facility, its collapsed dome still offering some protection from the elements. Inside, they found a space relatively untouched by the ravages of the Deadlands, dust-covered equipment, consoles with long-dead power cells, and most importantly, intact walls and portions of roof that would shield them from the approaching storm. "We should be safe here," Kale said, removing his helmet cautiously after checking his radiation detector. Levels are within tolerable limits inside the structure. Lyra followed suit, her silver eyes scanning their surroundings with cautious attention. "Why was this place abandoned? It seems largely intact." "Radiation leak, probably," Kale replied, inspecting a cracked reactor housing in the corner. "Early Dominion operations weren't big on safety protocols. They just move on when a site became too dangerous to work." They established a small camp in what appeared to have been an administrative office, using portable heaters to combat the deepening chill of the Deadlands night. Outside, the storm arrived in full force, wind howling around the structure and occasional flashes of unnatural lightning illuminating the interior through broken sections of the dome. As they shared a meager meal of nutrient packs, Kale found himself studying Lyra again. Without the immediate pressure of pursuit, he was noticing details he'd missed before. The intricate patterns that seemed to be natural markings on her skin along her temples and the backs of her hands, the way her silver eyes caught and reflected even the smallest light sources. "You're staring," she observed, a hint of amusement in her voice. Kale looked away, embarrassed. "Sorry, I've just never really been around non-humans much. Not for more than passing interactions, anyway. And now you're risking your life with one," Lyra noted. "Quite a change." "You're not what I expected," Kale admitted. The Dominion portrays Xylosians as manipulative, dangerous, using your abilities to undermine human prosperity. "And what do you think now?" Kale considered his answer carefully. "I think the Dominion fears what it cannot control. Your people's abilities represent a threat to their monopoly on information, on history itself." Lyra nodded, a hint of sadness crossing her features. "We were scholars once, you know, before the Dominion came to our world. Our entire civilization was built around the preservation and sharing of knowledge. We had great libraries, not of books, but of memories, centuries of experiences passed from generation to generation. What happened? What always happens when the Dominion arrives," Lyra said bitterly. "They called it integration, but it was conquest. Those who resisted were eliminated. Those who submitted had their children taken for re-education. And our memory libraries were destroyed, burned, or bombed out of existence. But not all the memories were lost," Kale guessed. Lyra's expression softened slightly. "No, some of us escaped with what we could carry, not in bags or data storage, but in our minds. We became wanderers, keeping the memories alive, sharing them when we found those who would listen, who would understand the importance of truth." "That's what you were doing on Kratos," Kale realized. "Finding people who wanted to know the truth about the Dominion." "Among other things," Lyra acknowledged, "there's a growing resistance, small cells scattered throughout Dominion space. We provide them with information, vulnerabilities, patrol schedules, command structures." "Your spies," Kale said, surprise evident in his voice. "We're truth-tellers," Lyra corrected. "The distinction matters to us." The storm outside intensified, the structure creaking under the assault of the wind. A section of ceiling collapsed in a distant part of the facility, the crash momentarily drowning out the storm's fury. "Do you think the Resistance has any real chance?" Kale asked after a long silence. "The Dominion controls so much territory, has such overwhelming military power. Empires seem invincible until they fall, Lyra replied. History, real history, teaches us that no system of oppression lasts forever. The question is how much suffering occurs before the fall, and what replaces it afterward. And what would replace the Dominion? More humans fighting for control. Lyra studied him, her silver eyes reflecting the small heat source between them. The Resistance, I know, envisions something different, a federation of worlds where each species governs itself while participating in a larger council, where knowledge is shared freely and no race claims inherent superiority over others. Sounds like a fantasy, Kale said, though without mockery. All change begins as fantasy, Lyra pointed out, as impossible dreams that enough people eventually decide to make real. The conversation lapsed into comfortable silence, each lost in their own thoughts as the storm raged outside. Despite the danger of their situation, fugitives in a toxic wasteland, hunted by one of the most powerful forces in known space, Kale realized he felt more alive, more purposeful than he had in years. They spent 3 days sheltering in the abandoned facility as the radiation storm swept over the Deadlands. During that time, their cautious alliance deepened into something approaching friendship. Lyra shared stories of Xylosian culture before the Dominion, tales of memory ceremonies where entire communities would gather to experience the recollections of elders, of science pursued for knowledge rather than profit, of art forms based on the manipulation of energy fields that created displays of light and sensation impossible to describe in human terms. In return, Kale spoke of his childhood on Centauri Prime, of his family before they were taken from him, of the dreams he'd once had of designing ships that would explore beyond known space. He found himself speaking of things he hadn't voiced in years, as if Lyra's presence unlocked something long dormant within him. On the 4th day, the storm finally abated, leaving behind an altered landscape. New dunes where flat plains had been, exposed rock formations where dust had been scoured away, the bones of long-dead creatures revealed by the shifting sands. They resumed their journey toward the northern mountains, now visible as a jagged line on the horizon. Their progress was steady but cautious, mindful of both the natural hazards of the Deadlands and the possibility of Dominion patrols searching for them. On the afternoon of the 6th day since their escape, as they traversed a particularly barren stretch of terrain, Lyra suddenly tensed. "Something's coming," she warned, her voice tight. Kale scanned the horizon, seeing nothing but dust and rock. "What? Where?" "I can feel it," she insisted, pointing to their left. Energy signatures, mechanical, but with organic components. Moments later, Kale heard it too, a low, thrumming sound that seemed to vibrate through the ground beneath their feet. Then he saw them, 3 large shapes moving rapidly across the desert floor, kicking up dust in their wake. Dominion scout vehicles, he identified grimly, pulling Lyra to a nearby rock formation. Biosynthetic engines. They must have expanded the search perimeter. They ducked behind the rocks, praying the vehicles would pass them by. But the machines altered course, heading directly toward their position. "They've spotted us," Lyra said unnecessarily. "The suit's transponders, they must be tracking them now." Kale cursed himself for not thinking of that possibility. Of course the Dominion would reprogram their systems to identify the stolen equipment. "We need to run," he urged, pulling her up. "If we can reach that ravine," he pointed to a narrow fissure in the terrain about 200 meters away. They sprinted across the open ground, the bulky environmental suits hampering their speed. Behind them, the scout vehicles accelerated, rapidly closing the distance. Energy weapons fired, blasts of superheated plasma striking the ground around them, sending up sprays of vitrified sand. 50 meters from the ravine, Lyra stumbled, her foot catching on a hidden obstacle. She fell heavily, a cry of pain escaping her as her leg twisted beneath her. Kale skidded to a stop, turning back to help her. "Go," she shouted, struggling to rise. "You can still make it." Instead, Kale ran to her side, hauling her up, supporting her weight as she limped forward. "Not without you," he grunted, The scout vehicles now, so close he could see the Dominion insignia emblazoned on their hulls. They weren't going to make it. The vehicles would be upon them before they reached the ravine. In desperation, Cale drew the pulse pistol he'd taken from the storage facility, knowing it was woefully inadequate against armored scouts. To his surprise, Lyra pushed him away, standing straight despite her injured leg. "Get down," she ordered, a new authority in her voice. Before Cale could protest, Lyra raised both hands toward the approaching vehicles. Her entire body seemed to vibrate with tension, and the air around her hands shimmered with energy. The patterns on her skin, those markings Cale had noticed earlier, began to glow with a soft blue light. A wave of force erupted from her outstretched hands. Not a focused beam like her earlier demonstration, but a rolling wall of energy that swept across the terrain. It struck the lead vehicle with such power that the machine flipped backward, crashing into the second scout. Both tumbled in a tangle of metal and synthetic components. The third vehicle swerved to avoid the collision but lost control, skidding sideways before rolling multiple times and coming to rest on its side. Lyra collapsed to her knees, her breathing labored, the glow fading from her skin. "That's not something I could do often," she gasped. Cale stared at her in amazement, then at the disabled vehicles. I didn't know your people could do that." "Most can't," she admitted, allowing him to help her up. "I'm what my people call a conduit, someone who can channel and amplify the natural energy manipulation abilities of our race." Figures were emerging from the wrecked vehicles, Dominion troops, dazed but armed and angry. "We need to move," Cale urged, supporting Lyra as they hurried toward the ravine. They reached the narrow fissure just as energy blasts began to pepper the rocks around them. The ravine provided cover from direct fire, but it was a dead end, a winding crack in the earth that extended perhaps a kilometer before terminating at a rock wall. "We're trapped," Cale realized as they moved deeper into the ravine, seeking temporary shelter from their pursuers. "Not necessarily," Lyra countered, studying her wrist computer. "The communications relay I mentioned, it's just on the other side of this ridge. That's why they intercepted us here. They must have detected our approach and sent those scouts. So, the relay is still active? Your contacts might be there." "There's only one way to find out," Lyra said, pointing upward. "We need to climb." The ravine walls were steep but not sheer, a difficult climb under normal circumstances, made more challenging by their bulky suits and Lyra's injured leg. But the alternative was to wait for capture. They could hear the Dominion troops entering the ravine, their communications echoing off the stone walls. They shed the heaviest parts of their environmental suits, keeping only the essential components that would protect them from radiation. With lighter loads, they began to scale the ravine wall, finding handholds in the rough stone, helping each other over the more difficult sections. Cale went first, testing handholds and creating a path for Lyra to follow. Despite her injury, she climbed with determination, her natural agility compensating somewhat for her handicap. When they were about halfway up, a shout from below indicated they'd been spotted. Energy blasts struck the rock face, sending chips of stone flying. Cale pulled Lyra into a small recess, shielding her with his body as debris rained down around them. "We're too exposed," he said grimly. "They'll pick us off before we reach the top." Lyra's silver eyes met his, and in them, he saw not defeat but resolve. "I have an idea," she said, "but I'll need your help. My energy reserves are low after stopping those vehicles." "Anything," Cale promised without hesitation. "Give me your hands," she instructed. When he complied, she placed his palms against her temples, where the glowing patterns had been most prominent. "Focus your thoughts on energy, on power flowing from you to me." "I don't understand how." "You don't need to understand," she interrupted. "Just believe it's possible. Intention matters in energy transfer." Feeling slightly foolish but trusting her, Cale closed his eyes and concentrated on the idea of his energy flowing into Lyra. To his astonishment, he felt a warmth spreading from his center, down his arms, through his hands, a draining sensation that wasn't entirely unpleasant. When he opened his eyes, Lyra's skin was again glowing with those intricate patterns, her silver eyes now radiant like twin stars. She turned toward the ravine below, where the Dominion troops were advancing, and raised one hand. The air shimmered, and a section of the ravine wall collapsed, sending tons of rock crashing down, blocking the path of their pursuers. Screams and the crackle of emergency communications echoed up from below, but no more energy blasts followed them. "That should buy us time," Lyra said, her voice sounding distant and strained. "We need to keep moving." They resumed their climb, Kale now feeling a fatigue that hadn't been present before, understanding that something of his own energy had indeed transferred to Lyra. The concept should have seemed impossible, yet he had felt it happen, a sharing more intimate than any physical connection. They reached the top of the ridge as the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the rugged landscape. On the other side, nestled in a protected valley, was their destination. A small facility built into the mountainside, its communications array extending skyward like a metallic tree. "There it is," Lyra breathed, relief evident in her voice. "And it looks intact." They began their descent into the valley, moving as quickly as caution would allow. As they neared the facility, Kale noticed something that sent a chill through him despite the environmental suit's temperature regulation. "Lyra," he said quietly, "look at the entrance." The main doors of the facility hung open, twisted outward as if forced. No lights were visible inside, and a deathly silence surrounded the place. "No," Lyra whispered, her pace increasing despite her injury. "No, no, no." They approached cautiously, weapons drawn. Inside, the facility was dark, emergency lighting providing the only illumination. And everywhere was evidence of violence, scorch marks from energy weapons, equipment destroyed, and worst of all, bodies. 3 of them, dressed in nondescript clothing rather than Dominion uniforms, lay where they had fallen in defense of the outpost. Lyra moved to each body, checking for signs of life they both knew wouldn't be found. "They were here," she said, her voice hollow. "My contact and her team. The Dominion found them." Kale examined the communications equipment, most of it damaged beyond repair. "This didn't just happen," he noted. "These bodies are days old. The Dominion must have discovered this place shortly after your capture." "They torture me for information," Lyra said dully. "I gave them nothing, but perhaps they found other sources. Other memory keepers who weren't as strong." Her shoulders slumped, the weight of failure evident in every line of her body. Kale moved to her side, placing a hand on her shoulder. "We need to keep moving. The troops from the ravine will find a way around the blockage eventually." "To where?" Lyra asked, gesturing around them. This was her only hope of contacting the resistance, of getting off-world. "We're stranded, Kale. The Dominion will hunt us until they find us." Kale refused to accept defeat. "There must be something here we can use." He began searching the facility more thoroughly, looking for anything that might have survived the Dominion's attack. In what appeared to be a storage room, he found a cache of supplies that had escaped notice, probably because they were hidden behind a false wall that had been partially exposed in the battle. Among the items was a small communications device unlike any Dominion tech he'd seen. "Lyra," he called, "look at this." She joined him, her expression changing from despair to cautious hope as she examined the device. "It's a quantum entanglement communicator," she explained. "Impossible to trace or intercept. The Resistance uses them for the most sensitive communications." "Can you operate it?" "Yes," she said, already activating the device. "But I don't know if anyone will respond." If the Dominion found this outpost. The device hummed to life, emitting a soft blue glow. Lyra input a series of commands, then spoke in a language Kale didn't recognize, flowing and musical, with sounds no human throat could easily produce. After a tense moment, the device flickered and a response came, a voice speaking in the same alien tone. "They're alive," Lyra breathed, responding rapidly. "Some of the networks survived. They're sending a ship." She looked up at Kale, hope blazing in her silver eyes. "A fast courier vessel. It could be here in 6 hours. Will that be soon enough?" "The Dominion will be coming from multiple directions now," Lyra acknowledged. "We need to defend this position until the ship arrives." They set to work, using what remained of the facility's systems to establish early warning perimeters, crafting impromptu defenses from damaged equipment, and positioning themselves to make best use of the limited cover available. Through it all, Kale couldn't help but marvel at the change in Lyra. Where before there had been a quiet defiance, now there was fierce determination, a leader emerging from the fugitive. "Why are you looking at me like that?" she asked as they finished their preparations. "You're different," Kale observed. "Since we made contact with your people." Lyra paused, considering his words. "Hope changes people," she said finally. "For days now, I've been thinking only of survival." Now, she looked toward the sky, where somewhere beyond the dust-choked atmosphere, a ship was racing to their rescue. "Now I'm thinking of the future again." The perimeter alarm sounded before Kale could respond. Dominion forces approaching from the south, the direction of the ravine. Not just troops this time, but a full assault team with heavy weapons. "They're not taking chances," Kale noted grimly, checking the power cell on his weapon. "They want us dead, not captured." "They want me dead," Lyra corrected. "You they might still take alive." Kale gave her a long look. "I made my choice when I jumped onto that platform, Lyra. I'm not turning back now." The assault began with a bombardment, energy mortars raining down on the facility, further damaging the already compromised structure. Kale and Lyra took cover in the communications room, the most protected part of the outpost. After the initial barrage, troops advanced, methodical, professional, clearing sections of the approach with practiced efficiency. Kale and Lyra held them off as best they could, using their knowledge of the facility's layout to ambush smaller groups, to fall back to prepare positions when overwhelmed. 3 hours into the siege, with 3 more to go before their rescue might arrive, Kale took a glancing hit from an energy blast. The wound wasn't serious, but it slowed him, and their defenses were already stretched thin. "We need to consider alternatives," he gasped as Lyra applied a medical patch to his injured side. "They'll breach the inner perimeter soon." "I know," she acknowledged, her own fatigue evident. "I've been thinking, there's one option we haven't considered." "What's that?" Lyra's silver eyes held his. "I can share memories with you. Everything I know about the Dominion, about the Resistance, about Xylosian history. If only one of us escapes." "Don't talk like that," Kale interrupted. "We're both getting out of here." "We have to be realistic," Lyra insisted. "The transfer would take only minutes, but it would leave me weakened. You would carry what I know to the Resistance." Kale shook his head firmly. "No, we stand together. If this is where it ends, then it ends for both of us." "But I refuse to believe that." He checked the facility's sensors. "They're regrouping. We have maybe 15 minutes before the next push." "Kale," Lyra said softly, placing a hand on his cheek. "These past days, I've never known a human like you. I wish we had met in different circumstances." Without thinking, Kale covered her hand with his own. "We'll have time," he promised. "After this." The moment stretched between them, charged with unspoken emotions. Then an alert from the communications device broke the spell, a message in that flowing alien language that made Lyra's eyes widen. "The ship," she translated quickly. "It's ahead of schedule. 20 minutes out." Hope surged through Kale, giving him renewed energy despite his wound. "We just need to hold them off a little longer." They returned to their defensive positions just as the Dominion forces launched their next assault. This time, they came from multiple directions, coordinating their attack to divide the defenders' attention. Kale and Lyra fought desperately, using every advantage the familiar terrain provided. In the chaos of battle, Kale lost track of time. He knew only the rhythm of combat. Fire, move, take cover, repeat. His side burned where he'd been wounded, but adrenaline kept the pain at bay. Lyra fought beside him, using both her weapon and her energy manipulation abilities, though each use of the latter left her visibly drained. A massive explosion rocked the facility. The Dominion had breached the main defense perimeter. Troops poured in, forcing Kale and Lyra to fall back to their final position in the communications room. "How much longer?" Kale shouted over the sound of weapons fire as they sealed the reinforced door. Lyra, check the communications device. The ship is entering atmosphere. 5 minutes, maybe less. They'll break through this door in 2, Kale said grimly, eyeing the reinforced barrier that was already beginning to glow red as the Dominion troops applied cutting tools to the other side. Lyra's expression was resolute as she moved to stand beside him. Then we make these 2 minutes count. The door gave way in a shower of molten metal. Dominion troops charged through the breach, weapons firing. Kale and Lyra returned fire from behind overturned equipment, every shot carefully placed to maximize effectiveness. A blast caught Kale in the shoulder, spinning him to the ground. Through a haze of pain, he saw Lyra standing over him, one hand firing her weapon, the other extended toward the troops, a shimmering field of energy partially deflecting their fire. She couldn't maintain it. He could see the strain on her face, the patterns on her skin flickering like dying lights. Just as her defenses were about to collapse, a new sound cut through the battle. The roar of engines, powerful and close. The entire facility shook. Dust and debris rained from the ceiling. The Dominion troops paused in their assault, looking upward in confusion. Through the breach in the facility's roof, Kale caught a glimpse of a ship unlike any he'd seen. Sleek, organic in design, hovering directly overhead. A beam of intense light shot down from the vessel, enveloping Kale and Lyra. He felt a strange sensation, as if his body were becoming lighter, insubstantial. The Dominion troops resumed firing, but their weapons passed harmlessly through the light beam. The last thing Kale saw before the world dissolved around him was the faces of their attackers contorted in frustrated rage. Then there was only light and the sensation of rapid movement. When his vision cleared, he found himself in a circular chamber, its walls adorned with flowing patterns similar to those on Lyra's skin. She stood beside him, supporting herself against a console, exhaustion evident in every line of her body, but very much alive. "We made it," she breathed, a smile breaking across her features. "Welcome to a resistance vessel, Kale." Other figures moved around the chamber. More Xylosians, their blue skin varying in shade from pale azure to deep indigo. They spoke rapidly in their native language, though some phrases in common were interspersed as they tended to the new arrivals. A medical technician approached Kale, examining his wounds with professional efficiency. "You'll live," the alien pronounced in accented common, "though you may wish otherwise when the pain blockers wear off." Kale hardly registered the comment, his attention fixed on Lyra as she conferred with what appeared to be the ship's captain. Despite her obvious fatigue, she carried herself with dignity and purpose, speaking with an authority that commanded respect. When she returned to his side, her expression was complex, relief mingled with determination, joy shadowed by lingering concern. "We're setting course for a resistance stronghold," she informed him. "A moon in the Eridian system, outside Dominion." "Space. What happens there?" Kale asked, suddenly uncertain of his place in this alien environment, in this conflict that had been Lyra's but was now somehow his as well. "That depends on you," she replied. "The resistance can find you a safe haven, a new identity. You've earned that much and more by helping me escape." Kale considered the offer, thinking of the relative safety it promised, a chance to disappear, to rebuild some semblance of a normal life. Yet even as the thought formed, he knew it wasn't what he wanted. "And if I want to stay?" he asked. "To help." Lyra's silver eyes widened slightly, then softened. "The resistance always needs skilled technicians," she said, "especially ones who have proven their courage and commitment." "Is that all I've proven?" Kale asked quietly, holding her gaze. A smile touched her lips, genuine and warm. "No," she admitted, "not all." She moved closer, taking his hand in hers. The patterns on her skin glowed softly, and he felt a gentle warmth spreading from her touch. Not the draining sensation of their earlier energy transfer, but something nurturing, healing. "We have a saying among the memory keepers," Lyra said softly. "Knowledge shared is never lost." I think the same is true of other things that are shared. Her fingers intertwined with his. "Courage, trust, hope, love," Kale suggested, the word escaping before he could consider its implications. Rather than answer directly, Lyra leaned forward and pressed her forehead to his. A gesture he somehow understood was deeply significant in her culture. "The future is uncertain," she said. "The Dominion is powerful, and our struggle will be long. But whatever comes, we face it together now." Through the ship's viewport, Kale could see the stars streaking past as they accelerated away from Kratos, from the life he had known. Ahead lay the unknown. Danger, certainly, but also purpose, community, and a woman whose life he had saved on an impulse that had changed everything. Together, he agreed, and in that moment, it felt like the beginning of a greater story rather than the end of their flight. Not just survival, but the chance to build something new, to fight for a better future among the stars. In Lyra's silver eyes, he saw that future reflected, uncertain but bright with possibility, like the distant stars they now raced toward, free at last from the shadow of execution and the chains that had bound them both.